Uh, Great. So let's talk about money. I think that it's high time to talk about money because we have heard a great conversation with my foreign minister, then a debate between strategies, and very often they quote some numbers, they express opinions about money in the terms if Russia is able to finance the war and what is the limit of Russian financial sources. Some people also said that GDP is not able to stop tanks. So now among excellent panelists, I think economists, I think that we should take a very good look at the let's say financial order, global order, and let's say competition between autocracies and democracies, and also how investment, trade may change politically countries. I think that we are now in Poland, the country which is a very good example of strong correlation between liberalization and democratization. And in Poland, we introduced in the very first momentum in the beginning of 90s all important economic institutions. We introduced so-called shock therapy and then democratic institutions as well. But Poland is probably now a very unique example. We have many authoritarian regimes with a very significant economic growth. First of all, China, with the second biggest economy in the world, and many others who say that we may develop economic relations, even have free trade, free investments, and still have a very authoritarian regime. So I hope that after this debate, this 1 hour, we will get a clear answer what is the relation, and of course we'll focus on the main players in this context: China, Russia, and other regimes. So, Andrzej, let's start from you. We all know that you are focusing on Russia, and also on sanctions against Russia. We all would like to see more serious sanctions and the impact which would definitely damage the Russian economy. But what is your take in this regard? I mean, how do you assess the current situation? And briefly speaking, do you think that Russia is running out of money soon, and probably after some time there will be no resources, financial resources to continue the war in Ukraine? Or maybe you see that the Chinese support, and also if you may say a few words about this, it's so significant that definitely this country would be able to continue the war.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's one of the really crucial, fundamental questions. And I'm not sure that I can answer it. I should say, first, I'm not an economist, unlike the rest of you. But from sort of the European security perspective, it's of course one of the absolutely key questions. And there's a lot of very lively debate about the state of Russian economy. My take, as someone who advises on policy, is we should try as much as possible to unpower Russia, and my institute is publishing a long-read report on this today. And Russian economy may help us eventually to unpower Russia, but I think it's not a prudent policy to wait for it, to expect Russian economy to do the job for us. We have to act on our own to unpower Russia. We have to increase our resilience against, these increasingly brazen hybrid campaigns. We have to better deter Russia, conventionally, non-conventionally. We also have to look into Russian vulnerabilities and exploit them better. So, right now, to go back to your question, Russian oil, Urals, is trading somewhere around $50 per barrel. This is $17 or $19.7 below what the Russian budget is constructed around. So it's also $10 below the oil cap, which means that unfortunately we see some entities from even EU member states to get back on the shipping market. But if we manage somehow, of course this is due to the disruptions in the global economy that we are seeing right now. This is not necessarily sort of direct effect of something that the EU is doing, but if we manage, if we find a way to keep the price below, I think that's one of the really crucial indicators for Russian budget. Then, if we manage to do that, if we better enforce the cap, if we lower the cap, and if we go more aggressively after the shadow fleet, for example, now we have the 17th sanctions package just approved by the member state, right? So we have 342 vessels in the shadow fleet already under sanctions, so no port access in the EU, no service in the shipyards. But perhaps we can even consider going a little bit further. And Minister Sikorski spoke about these huge environmental risks. And you know, when you look at the kind of the trajectories, the path of these shadow fleet tankers, they are encircling Europe, and then they go to the Mediterranean, and then there are these interchange points. And this is really, I fully agree, this is an environmental disaster in waiting. And we should sort of be perhaps more assertive in enforcing also our environmental standards and environmental security here. But if we manage to keep the oil price down $50 or so for an extended period of time, yes, then I believe Russian finances will get into a problem. And my sense is that the Russian state can take some sort of orthodox measures. They can cut on social spending, they can issue bonds, but eventually they may need to resort to some sort of unorthodox measures. And then it starts to be interesting, I think, the political impact of those unorthodox measures. So I don't think that Russian economy is an excellent state. Of course, we are all aware of these structural issues it suffers from. I'm not sure that it's about to collapse, but there are things that we can do and vulnerabilities that we can exploit. And that leads me to the second question you asked about the role of China in all this, about in this adaptation, this sort of decoupling from the West that is now happening. And part of that is internal restructuring of Russian economy, less share of external imports, less share of exports, more domestic demand driven by public spending. But it's of course also about solving supply chains problems, because decoupling from the West is very difficult. We can come back to that perhaps a little later, of course. Also finding new markets for raw materials. And China's role is very important here, because China's imports of Russian oil and gas doubled in 2024 compared to 2021. And of course, there are also imports, including of these dual-use items. According to some estimates, in 2023, some 90% of Russian imports of dual-use items came from China. And to be fair, a lot of these were re-exports. So these were made in the West, but then traded through China. So yes, China is very important in that, and perhaps we can also think of ways how to increase the pressure on China. And we know that China responds to pressure to deal with it, not perhaps to resolve the issue of evasion. There will always be evasion, but I think ultimately the sanctions will always be sort of a leaky ship, if you like. But I think it's more important what kind of guns the ship is armed with than whether there is some sort of leakage or not. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
So please correct me if I'm wrong. Without China, in a short-term perspective, Russia would be not able to continue the war, right? Because just coming back, for example, to the 90s, when many people said that Russia is too big to be a typical petro state, and Russia needed at the time Western investment. Now, Russia is too big to be in North Korea, so need China for modernization and for covering the consumption, right? This is what you would like to say.
Well, I'm not sure that it's just China, but of course there is this decoupling from the West that is ongoing, and China plays a very important role in that, as far as I can tell. But then there are others. There is India as well. There are other countries that increase their imports of Russian oil. So it's not just about China, but China's role is very important here, and I think this is where we see sort of political interest on the part of China, which doesn't want Russia to fail in its war of aggression against Ukraine. This is where we clearly diverge. But there is also economic interest. And it's very pragmatic, and there are growing asymmetries. Now, I think the share of Russian imports from China is around 30%, even more, 35%. The share of Russians' exports to China in terms of the size of the Chinese imports is 3%, so it's 1/10. And then we can talk about, the share of the settlements that are done in yuan, and how convertible this is, and what share of transactions Russia is doing with others is settled in yuan. So there is an increasing dependency, and this is not necessarily good news for Russia. But I don't think that, while this may cause friction, and not everybody in Moscow may be excited about that, about the prospect of China being more engaged in Arctic projects, for example, that there is a potential for some sort of conflict in the short term.
Before coming to China and to Liana, because your work is extensively on China, I would like to ask Kaush. Of course, Russian-Chinese trade is nominated in their currencies. And there is a currency swap. So they dream, Chinese and Russians' dream is to create a world without dollar, so-called dollarization. Do you think that the current policy of the US administration can help to make this dream reality, that more and more countries would trade without dollar, and what does it mean for US policy?
Well, good afternoon, I think. Thanks. I don't want to put people to sleep by talking about dollar, which is a complicated theme, but the short answer is yes, it may appear from the outside that the policies at this moment, particularly two-part, whether it be the tariff issue and also our just passed the bill, our debt issues, that they might affect the dollar. But these issues are not something new. We've had this cyclically through our economies. And it's, at the end of the day, it's the dynamism of American economy, which I think I have full faith in, and most people would for some time. But let me just pivot a little bit, because we are talking about, without jumping too much in the details, it'd be useful to talk about democracies, autocracies, and financial system or economy. Something that earlier panels said, and I'll build upon it, we're sort of moving from an era of unrestrained globalization to an era where perhaps it would be a more stratified globalization. And that's where, because we never had this issue of both democracies and autocracies so economically integrated into each other. That's the new challenge that we are facing. But before we jump all the way down to dollar or how this works, we've had a system that we developed of globalization, which presumed, very similar to what Europe did before in the military front, that we'll never have these sort of issues ever to face again. A war in Ukraine. We would not have a rising China which will say, I want to take Taiwan. And so we said, well, we'll merrily just go along and go where the bottom dollar goes. Those days are over. And a lot of people overestimate and say, well, that's the end of globalization. No, it's not. Global trade's not over, but it'll certainly have to change. It could no longer be the end product, which was largely for the last 20, 30 years, was that let's make everything global. Now it is a means to an end, which is to say our national security, economic security, are the prominent objective in which global trade has to feed into it. And that leads to coming up with a very complicated system where it says on some sectors, we will have no longer a coupling between our economy and our adversary or our enemy's economy. There will be some sectors in which we would like to de-risk our economies from our adversaries' economies, not fully decouple, but not be completely integrated. And there'll be some sectors in which it may be fully integrated, and it may be like before, there'll be furnitures, whether it be something like making toys, that could be, I don't know why we would restrict it. If we are talking about electric vehicles or solar panel, we'll try to de-risk each other as opposed to completely decoupling. When we're talking about semiconductors and very sensitive technology, we would probably end up decoupling. So it's a very complicated sort of a new term in which the old messages and the old monikers, let's just go to WTO, WTO is a good system, let's help it resolve. That doesn't work anymore. So you are looking at the recreation of that system with these trade deals that are coming into play, and in which I would like to sort of respectfully submit to my European colleagues, every time they refer to China as the second largest economy, it ain't so. EU is the second largest economy. China is the third largest economy. US and EU, in all these three categories, are not only the first and second largest economy, but they're also the world's most integrated economy, a lot more than we are with China, which gives about $8 trillion investment both ends. We got goods, we got services, we got issues related to surplus on both ends. And as we go forward, the most important agreements you would see is among the economies which are more than half of global GDP, is the US-EU trade agreement, which will happen. It's the US-UK that has been announced, the details we worked out. All of them will take time and detail. US-India would happen, US-Japan would happen. Now, collectively, that's more than half of global GDP, and it'll happen on those sort of three stratified stuff. We will decouple something, we'll de-risk something, and then we'll probably go along with where we are at. In that broader context, you know, I'm happy to take the dollar point, but I don't want to put people to sleep. I mean, it's a complicated thing than how dollar, it's not only a question related to, you know, whether the BRICS wants to have their own currency, how American domestic policy works on it. It's an issue always of relative to what. Renminbi and ruble are never going to challenge dollar. It's not happening anytime soon because they cannot even fully convert their stuff and float it. So that's not the end of it. The strength of the euro, the strength of the rupee, the strength of the yen are more relevant issues. Central bank digital currencies are important issues, so I'll leave it to Q&A if people really want to go down that road. But the broader theme ought to be, we're moving to a complicated system which is post-WTO, which is post-unrestrained globalization, and which will have stronger coordination among almost what I call a global quad of economic power, which is US, EU, Japan, India, and certainly UK fall into that. So that's where we are headed. They are sort of a turbulent time, but it's an interesting, fascinating where we go in this journey.
Thank you. We are talking about trade, of course, and what I understood that your vision is that probably we'll have a two sphere of trade. I mean, let's say normal global trade and trade of sensitive or strategic goods, no doubt. But what about investments? I would like to ask Liana about investments, which is, let's say, the next step of, after trade, very often investments are coming, and then we have a very close economic relations. How do you perceive the investments, especially from China? In Germany, you just came from Germany, and also in Europe, in other countries. Should we be very cautious to what extent maybe some specific sectors? Very often we have the debates in European countries. We all see what's going on with Russian investments in Europe, also in Germany. Do you think that in the future we will face the same situation with Chinese investments? And what are the consequences of this?
Thanks so much. I'm not only coming from Germany, I actually am German. I think you cannot miss my accent, which doesn't go away no matter how many years in Washington I spend. Let me perhaps start with the example of Germany that you raised, because I think it's a very good example to exemplify not only where the stream of investments is going, but the fundamental dilemma that Europe faces right now with the Trump administration, and on the other hand, with a China that is basically becoming the Germany from the past. Germany always loved to call itself the expert world master. Well, now we have China as the expert world master, which poses significant problems. As my bookings colleague and friend Constanze Stelzmüller has coined, talking about Germany, Germany has outsourced its energy to Russia, outsourced its demand and economic activity to China, and its security to the United States. That was the old saying, right? If you look at the situation now, all these three areas, economy, security, and energy, Germany has outsourced to the United States. On all three areas, Germany is now dependent on the United States. And in all three areas, those are, since January 20, challenged. We have a economic dependence. Germany has massively invested in the United States in recent years, which is put at risk not only for Germany but also for the United States with a trade and tariff war, which is much worse than Europeans initially expected. We have an energy dependency on the United States, which has not materialized, but there are certainly worst case scenario fears that this could be weaponized. And then obviously a security dependency, which despite all European efforts to become self-sufficient is still there for a long time to come. And in that picture, the China question becomes, from a European perspective, more rosy looking than it has been, right? Europeans have moved in the past to a more critical view of China, to a more confident view on their economic security. Germany has done some inward FDI screening because it has sold, many of you know this, the robotic company KUKA to China, which it now certainly regrets. We had a discussion about Chinese shares in the Hamburg toll and Chinese investments in other firms. So we had a trajectory of Germany and Europe that was going to, we have to be more careful with China, both in the economic sphere and in the security sphere because of its support for Russia. Now suddenly China looks as a very promising hedge for some Europeans. Because from a European perspective, the question, especially for example for Southern Europeans like Spain, is can we afford a two-front trade war with the United States and with China at the same time? And China is using this opportunity, right? I mean, China is complementing Europe, is trying to pretend that Europe and China are on the same page with the multilateral order, where the United States is the disruptive factor here. We see this now in China has lifted sanctions on European parliamentarians, which put the the agreement on investment on ice in 2021. So this is a clear sign that China is hoping to revive the comprehensive agreement on investment with the European Union. We also have clear signs that China wants to negotiate on the EV tariffs, perhaps is even willing to lower its own tariffs for European car imports, which would actually not help Europe a lot because the Chinese market is already saturated. But now we come to a point where Europeans are really between a rock and a hard place. Because what we see from Washington these days is that there's no clear China policy, right? I mean, the China hawks in Washington are somewhat disappointed so far. There could be a scenario where there's a big deal made with China. There could also be a scenario where tensions between the United States and China escalate. There could be an abandonment of Taiwan. There could be a defense of Taiwan. Everything is pretty much in the open in Washington, D.C. right now. And that is the danger from a European perspective if it starts to look eastward again, after it has focused so much on the United States under the Biden administration. There will certainly be a backlash from an administration that doesn't want Europeans to do that. But at the same time, China has become the real challenge for Europeans themselves, not only because the United States tells Europeans it's your challenge, but also Chinese massive overcapacities are going to Europe. All the other markets are closed. And China's support for Russia's war, and I'm just underlying what you're saying, is even intensifying. And the United States has stopped to put any pressure on China for that support of Russia's war. And the European Union just keeps up some sanctions which don't really matter. So this is going to be, especially this year, but also going into the next year, the crucial question for Europeans. do they perceive China as the economic insecurity threat to their own interests, or do they follow the short-term temptation out of frustration with Donald Trump and the United States to use China as a hedge and as the allegedly more reasonable and more cooperative partner?
Thank you. Before opening the floor for questions from the audience, so please prepare if you have some comments or intervention. I would like to just give you the last question to all of you regarding the frozen assets. It was mentioned during the conversation with Mr. Sikorski, and definitely it's a political decision of European countries not only to use rates, but also to confiscate all, it's around $200 billion, right, in European banks, plus Japan also has some 70 billion US dollars of Russian frozen assets. And one of the political argumentation among those who are not completely a big fan of full confiscation is that it would have a very negative effect on European, or first of all on the financial order, but also of investments in Eurobonds, in European reserves made by authoritarian regimes, other countries who would probably get a very bad signal that their money would be also confiscated in the future. So I would like to ask you how to resolve this problem. First of all, do you see dependency on Western countries in Europe, also United States, in terms of investments coming in their bonds coming from authoritarian regimes? And second, what would be your advice to use Russian frozen assets fully, just to convince those who are against this? So.
You want me to go first? Yes. It should have been done yesterday. I think the notion about that this is being talked about today, you know, again, I apologize for so I've been going to the 3 Cs in 3 days in Rome and Constanta, Bucharest, and here, and my bags haven't kept up with me. But anyway, you know, Elliot made a good point, and so did Began before that, Steve. When you're trying to explain to Americans why we are engaged in Europe for Ukraine, because it's important, and it's important for the Europeans. And then there's reported that by the time we're going to ask from Ukraine for this reparation, which is going to be far in extent of $350 billion, but we already have this money, but we can't use it because of what? Nobody can actually get up on a table and explain to a layperson why they are not doing it. There are several complicated and entirely bureaucratic. I'm not saying that they are not significant, but they are not significant compared to the stakes at play. You can't tell me that like you heard, that Russia, Elliot says, this Ukraine attack is not only an attack, but is to undermine the entire European security network. But no, the Europe thinks $350 million, taking it away somehow is going to take care of, you know, tackle a boat somehow, an investment in Europe. Now, I would argue that there is I say it's not an insignificant thing, but you've got to bet on your market. That's what we Americans do. You asked me about dollars. You bet on your market, you bet on what your economic situation is, and let's see who else, there are better place to invest than Europe and America or Japan. I don't see anything anytime future, including India, including all the Middle East. I don't see it. So I would take it absolutely. I mean, I think more you talk about it, weaker the argument goes. And I will tell this argument is somewhat similar to what Slavek talked about. The more you talk about, you know, sending brigades without having any, is a kind of a similar argument to saying, okay, well, we got some money, but I don't think we should really use it, but we really, really, really want, you know, Russia to pay for Ukraine reparations, and by the way, we also want to charge them an international criminal court. For a layperson, that sounds a little bit odd.
Yeah, well, partly we use. I mean, we just use the rates. So we separated the assets from the interest rates. Andrei.
Well, first of all, I think we should confiscate the assets and create, a sovereign Ukraine fund and give it to Ukrainians for reconstruction and for buying weapons for their defense. I understand there are arguments made against this in the debate, whether to do it at all or how exactly to do it. Yes, I mean, we've been talking a lot about it. Some member states have this idea that, yes, perhaps we can confiscate a part and then a little more, depending on how the peace talks are going and whether we have a sustained ceasefire or not. I think we are not nearing a consensus there, but I think we should do it. And I'm personally, I don't feel competent to assess the risks of doing that. I think it's about risk management. Will there be a capital outflow from Europe? Where does the capital go? To me, that's the question of sort of like assessing the global economic landscape. Then are there ways to mitigate the risks? Like by creating this fund and say, we are basically lending the money to Ukraine, and if Russia pays the reparations, something happens in the future. Will it help or not? Will we be able to argue that this is a truly exceptional case? Yes, because the title of the panel is Autocracies and Democracies, and yes, there are many actors out there who may see this as putting their own assets in risk, but if we argue that what Russia is doing to Ukraine is something really, really unique, and this is why we are taking this step. Perhaps that's part of the mitigation strategy. But I think we should be thinking really hard how to make this happen.
Thank you. Liana, your take.
Well, I think we all know who is one of the main holdouts here, and that is Germany. So I think the smartest approach is not only to think, about the general arguments, but also to think about the actual measures that you can take and that European friends and colleagues can take to convince the new German government, because we have a new German government it's only 14 days, 2 weeks that they are in, and Europeans have an opportunity there to get the new government moving, which remains very cautious on this issue until today. What are the two arguments that can be helpful? The first argument is, you might have heard, Germany has obviously liberated its defense spending. Defense spending has been excluded from the famous German debt brake and is basically unlimited, right? I mean, defense spending has no ceiling, can be debt financed, whatever is needed. But that is not necessarily money that is all going into Ukraine, right? I mean, you can't put all the Ukraine support under the defense spending header. So apart from defense spending, the other flexibility that Germany has is an infrastructure fund for domestic purposes, and that's it. The remaining part of the German budget remains as tight as it is, and Ukraine support remains as much a budgetary challenge as it has been in the past. So the two arguments to advance there is, well, look, if you want to keep your coalition together of Social Democrats and Christian Democrats that only have a very tight majority, Friedrich Merz was elected only in the second round of the vote, you better create for yourself some budgetary flexibility so you don't end up in the same situation as the previous German government, which collapsed over internal differences about budgetary inflexibility. And the second argument is, well, if you want to keep up support for Ukraine in the German population, but also in general in the European population, at a time when the right-wing party in Germany, the extreme right-wing party Alternative for Germany, is a big shadow over this government, right? It has overtaken, in some opinion polls, the conservatives of Friedrich Merz. There is a saying that's going around, which I personally don't believe, and I don't find it's helpful, but there's a saying which says, well, this government, German government, is the last bullet that we have before the right-wing populists to take over. So the argument to make here, if you want to prevent that, if you want to prevent that right-wing populists will even increase in opinion polls, will make it difficult for your government to survive those next 4 legislative years, make the very compelling, not financial argument, but normative and moral argument to the German and the European public that Russia is paying for what it has done. That's easy. that's something where you don't even have to talk to your publics about all the complications once you have found a technical way around them and have reassured yourself. You could make the point, this is what is happening. Everyone will feel this is the right way of approaching this, regardless of ceasefire negotiations or the end state of peace talks. And you have created for yourself some domestic flexibility. I think that's the way to go. It's a political question, not only a financial question. It's a political question where certain capitals in the European Union, and especially Berlin, have to be convinced by their partners and have to be put under pressure throughout this year by their partners.
Just a point on it. You know, Switzerland's been making that argument for a long time. And everybody thought, especially Angela Merkel, that that argument had run its course.
Okay, great. We have 18 minutes for Q&A. So I see one hand here. Please.
Good afternoon, Justyna Sztudlik, the Polish Institute of International Affairs. To be frank, I have rather a comment than a question to Liana, because you said about this, from your perspective, from the, being in the United States, that Europe is becoming, or there is a kind of an appetite that we would like to be closer to China because of some problems in our relations with the US. And my perception is different, because I think that, first of all, China has not offered us anything in order to make us closer to China. You mentioned about these lifting sanctions. You know, it's only 2 or 3 people, nothing else. Of course, there is a campaign from Chinese side that they would like to talk about a comprehensive agreement of investment, but there is no appetite, zero, in the EU Commission to unfreeze the KAI. And to be honest, my perception is that because of China that is not interested in offering us something because of situation between US and Europe, we are becoming less relevant to China as Europe. No, nothing they would like to offer is only lip service, only narrative. And I do not think that there is any kind of appetite in the EU Commission. Okay, I know that may be a different situation in member states, but no appetite in the EU Commission to have closer relations with China, to have softer approach. So this is my comment. Just I would like to ask if you really see from the United States that we are becoming closer to China. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I personally certainly agree with you that I don't see any reason to move closer to China. I mean, what Beijing is really seeing, they're seeing Europe now as a ripe fruit, which is, you know, you just have to pick, because they perceive that Europe is under such pressure that it has no alternative but to turn towards Beijing, right? So the Chinese calculus is for not a lot of concessions, we can gain a lot and bring sort of Europe back to our side, or at least return to a status quo ante relationship with Europe. I do agree that the European Commission is certainly not the place where any of these discussions are taking place, and that is reassuring. I don't think this means that those discussions will not have influence. We see it in Spain, we see it in other member states that are more open to China. Certainly there's Poland or the Baltic states with their own experience, but we do see it in some member states. And the concerning trajectory that I see is that over time, that allure from China will only become greater, because I do think that, let's say, some initial shocks in the US-European relationships are now some weeks away already, but I do believe in the US-European relationship, we are not yet at a point of stabilization. I think we will go through a phase of further shocks, including on the security side, the forced posture review of the United States, a potential withdrawal of conventional troops from Europe. The NATO summit has been mentioned today, so we still have a lot of issues on the agenda, not to speak of Ukraine, the potential normalization of US-Russia relationship. So if those shocks continue, the balance in terms of how does China look to you will further shift. And that is when those voices in capitals in the European Union will become stronger, who say, well, look, again, we cannot afford a two-front trade war, and also is China's support for Russia's war really such a big problem for us that we would sacrifice our own economies for that?
May I add to that? I think I would agree with my colleague, but let's put a few things, I think, useful in this, and I appreciate your comments. One, European Union was not created to screw America. Okay, European Union was created to maintain peace in this continent as something that it has extraordinarily succeeded at. However, at the same time, you have Xi and Putin meeting in Moscow and in Beijing, openly conspiring to screw America. They're not hiding it, and pushing us off our pedestal. That's right. Not only are they openly conspiring to screw America, but the reason they want to conspire to screw us and push it off is because then there are a lot of cover for Europe and other places goes with it. Elliot Cohen sat here and said that, you know, again, that this war is not just about Ukraine, it's about undermining the European economy, security structure. Well, gee whiz, why do you think that China is supporting Russia in that war for that very purpose? You asked the question again before today. No, Russia cannot sustain this war without Chinese economic help, not at all. You got other players, but really China. Today you see that 2 wars that just happened cannot be sustained without Chinese backing. The Pakistan war in India, they cannot fight for 4 days without Chinese backing. And Russia, for sure, it's not just the economic, it is really the dual-use technologies which then shunned all of the big sanctions we put in, and we said they'll be out tomorrow, you know, they won't have chips and they won't have phones and the tanks won't work and all that. That all just works because China is supporting it. So let's be very clear about it. So in this context, the best stuff, and I think, again, I would urge, but Stephen always did a great job, and he's a fantastic thing in the morning, and both Elliot, I'll be consistent, the same theme. There is a justifiable emotional reaction from Europe to a sort of perhaps intemperate and somewhat unpredictable way of how American leadership may act. But if you like democracy to some degree, it's a counterintuitive point. You can actually see the most transparent thinking on TV that usually happens in behind closed doors. Same questions get asked, very similar, whether it be about our support to NATO, our engagement with, but President Trump does it like everything is out all the time. In that context, 2 things from our side are really important. There are folks that you heard, almost all Americans here make the point with transatlantic relationship. But these sort of illusions of getting caught between China and America in a trade war while saying without America we cannot sort of get NATO and Russia done, there is a stark dichotomy in this. It ain't lost on no American. So more this question posed again and again that you got to be here all the time supporting against Russia on a far distant land, but we don't want to get caught in an economic issue between you and China. This is what feeds into a lot of the stuff you would see. So, and I don't think it's real because you obviously it's not in European interest for saying, by the way, we have some issues with America, so we're going to turn into this big market for cheap Chinese industry because you ain't selling anything to China anytime soon. It will be basically an imports coming in. So you got to think about these things, and they have self-fulfilling prophecy to them, even if they are not real, but they are understandable, as my colleague mentioned.
Let me perhaps just add 1 sentence. I think what makes it more difficult for Europeans is also because they are getting such contradictory signals from the US, right? I mean, they were all prepared to come out with their proposals of, we do more in the Indo-Pacific, you stay engaged in Europe. The administration right now is not interested in those, right? There's no call for Europeans to become more engaged in the Indo-Pacific. There's no pressure being kept up on China for its support of Russia's war. To the contrary, President Trump has said multiple times that he hopes China can can play a positive role without sort of incentivizing China through pressure or any other means to do that. So these confusing signals about China are making it more complicated to Europe to navigate its way through the current
I think they're
situation.
justifiable, but let me just, again, Steve did a good example that you have a very unconventional president who does not follow you. I agree with you. This conventional understanding of being consistent across the board. That is not the theme that has. But there are these all very elements are there in every administration. They are just so much out there and in an unpredictable way. I don't disagree with it. But I think it's important to focus at the very end on what the actions are, but I do not disagree with you on the signals. But you got to kind of play with what you've got.
Okay, sorry, because I also would like to react if Europe could help US in its war with China, okay, let's make a deal. We may expect still US presence in Europe in terms of security, but what do you expect from us, from Europeans, to stop trade with China, to stop investments, or just, to have more American investments? This is another story. The problem is that we have just a few minutes, and I see 1-2 questions, so please, maybe we'll collect them, and then we'll see if we'll be able to fit to the framework. Please.
Good afternoon. Patryk Kugiel, Senior Analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. If this panel is about money, then I think we need to discuss foreign aid. So more than $200 billion flowing from global north to global south countries. And one of the biggest disruptions created by the Trump administration was massive cuts to US foreign aid, which sent shockwaves across the world, especially in developing countries. And US is not the only one that cuts foreign assistance, also Europeans, Brits and French and Germans and everyone in the West. So the question is what ramifications this can make on the international stability and perception of the Western democracies in the world. I've heard Kaush speaking at the Raisina Dialogue in Delhi this year, and I understand you are not a great fan of foreign aid, and you may even like Donald Trump's decision in this regard, but don't you think that actually this cutting of foreign aid creates additional instability in the world and strengthen the hand of autocracies that can very easily fill the void, the vacuum left by the Westerners withdrawing from this field of international affairs? Thank you.
Please, a short version now and a long version during the coffee.
So I worked at the USAID in the first Trump administration. So that's USAID is made out of great patriots, is the best of America. It has done its work and done very well, especially in Poland, since you mentioned about how dynamic Poland became. All the market reforms here were done by AID, supported by AID. So Poland's a good example. So is South Korea. So are a lot of places. Now, it's not the question so much about doing the aid per se. It's the transition of times. We're not keeping up with times. I think the model of development assistance has run its course. We're dealing with emerging economies with economic aspirations. We need to move from an era of development assistance paradigm to one of economic partnerships. That's the transition we are in. It's a little bit rocky, but that's where it's long overdue. And I think it's the right time, because just to make 2 points on this, the discussion about the demise of USAID is largely among the development community. Not that many people and Americans came to the street, which is really sad, because it's, as I said, it's the best of America. And more importantly, if you were at Raisina, you found me defending AID because the Indians said exactly that, hey, we've been telling you that this is really a corrupt organization, and now your own president says it. It's utter nonsense from what the Indians said there. Again, and so, but that is, and so the other one, there's also a lady from Niger. So then what is it that really I'm doing, in your point, which both the Indians and the Niger said that I'm obviously not doing it right. So I've got to change my view, and I cannot just say, let me just come around and peddle you climate change and social benefits. I have to address economic aspirations, or what you called Global South. Aid was a model that wasn't fit for it. A new model needs to be developed, and I think that's where we are headed, and it'd be a good outcome without denigrating the past, which was fantastic.
Okay. Andrew, do you want to add something, or the last question?
Well, perhaps just a footnote. My sense is, and I look at this more from the perspective of the European neighborhood, because this is sort of part of my file. I personally don't think that, at least from this vantage point, it's development assistance. It's not a paradigm that has run its course. It's a field of contestation, and others are already coming in and filling the void. And of course, this is not based on some sort of quantitative forecast, but I think these cuts are incredibly not just disruptive, but will decrease the stability and ultimately will come at perhaps a much higher cost. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Okay. And the last question, please.
Hello, so Patrick Labuda, Central European University. I have 2 quick questions for the panel. I mean, the first on the seizure of Russian assets. I think somebody said there's no obstacle. What about immunities under international law? Is that something that you're no longer taking into consideration, or policymakers are no longer taking into consideration? And is there not a risk that these kinds of arguments can be used against Western states, European states later on? And the second question, just sort of to connect a little bit to the theme of the panel, so on the enforcement of sanctions specifically, as we know, non-Western states, for the most part, are not big fans of sanctions. And is there anything that can be done to encourage non-Western democracies, in particular, to not do trade with Russia, to not support the Russian war economy? I'm thinking here in particular of states like Brazil, democratic non-Western states. Thank you.
Yeah, Liana, please.
Yeah, let me try to tackle the second question. First of all, I think in terms of sanctions evasion, we should look first at Western countries themselves, right? Because if you look at how many washing machines, fridges, and so on, suddenly Germany and other European countries are selling to Georgia or to Central Asian countries, that's not great. I don't think that the internal demand has suddenly risen by hundreds of %, and so many more Georgians are able to buy these utilities. So that's embarrassing. That's embarrassing for Europeans themselves, and they should look into their own files first to make sure that their economies do not benefit from evading sanctions through third countries. The second part about non-Western democracies, but also, I mean, of course, India plays a big role when it comes to Russian oil. I do think the law that is currently being drawn up on the Hill, where the idea is to increase pressure on Russia through secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil, is something which is a strong weapon against Russia. And equally, the European Union should respond with a weapon that says that the European Union is not buying any Russian oil and gas anymore. Because contrary to what the European Union often tries to portray itself, there's still Russian gas going to the European Union, not through pipeline, but through LNG gas, and there's also still Russian oil in the European Union, which goes through other countries like India. So if we are, first of all, clear with ourselves and stringent with ourselves, and then join efforts with those on the Hill who have understood that you need to work not only with carrots but also with sticks towards Russia. If you want to make the attempts of President Trump possible to achieve a ceasefire, then you could create a double momentum on the side of the European Union and also on the side of the United States. I know that energy prices are of course a major concern, especially for Europe, but again, working together and trying to create the conditions where this is possible is a window of opportunity for this year, not for next year.
Liana, Andrei, Karl, many thanks for great contribution, and please join me to thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for this engaging discussion. Mr. Director, I would like to ask you, what is your main takeaway from this discussion? What can we do with increasing dependencies on China?
Frankly speaking, I was a little bit surprised that the panelists are more or less on the same line regarding the Chinese investments, sanctions against Russia, frozen assets. So it's very optimistic that we are common understanding. The other question is, of course, to convince politicians to make a decision, because very often they say, decision makers, that because of the public support or so-called international financial order, they are not able to introduce a more serious decisions. Sanctions, of course, against Russia, this is something which is supported by majority of European countries. The last question about so-called bypassing countries, I think that we should definitely pay more attention on this, that definitely among Europeans, Americans, we are on the same page, but there are global south, many other countries in the world who just do not join the Western sanctions against Russia, and for these countries relatively easy to continue the trade and send their products on the other markets.
And do you think that should we be afraid of Chinese investments in Europe?
This is something what we just during this conversation explore in Germany, and I think that every single country has a different story. I mean, sometimes in the last decade we heard about Chinese investments in strategic sectors, like for example port in Haifa in Israel, or in United States, or in the Europe. Very often the infrastructure, let's say the very visible investments, and they cause some political debate. Now we are not observing a very controversial investments. However, I think that the level of Chinese money which are going in, let's say, non-strategic sectors is quite significant. We may compare Chinese investments also to the investments from Gulf states, and how they change let's say the landscape, and also what is the consequence, to what extent it's safe for receiving countries. In this debate about frozen assets of Russia, very often what I heard from French, Belgians or Germans is that the Gulf states would be the second, let's say, group of countries would carefully examine the situation of the assets, because of a huge amount of money which are located in European bonds.
I would like to follow up precisely on the issue of the seizure of the Russian assets. Are we adapting fast enough to counter autocracies? And what's your take on this issue?
I think that definitely we need more talks and decision among so-called global north. Very often we are talking about global south, but there's not so many institutions where we can talk together and create our standards and obey them, and then create natural advantages. Very often, especially in the United Nations, we are in minority, and that's why we have no clear advantages towards global south. However, with all respect, we should also have this dialogue and formula how to create a, let's say, more just fair global order. I'm not quite sure if the proposal made by China and Russia nowadays to create a real multipolar world, it is something which serves to global South interest. With all our history, I think there is more understanding in Europe and the United States how we may identify problem of global South. Maybe today we didn't elaborate this issue too much, and how we may react to the Chinese or Russian proposal, which is a very short-term, let's say, investments and have very many negative effects.
Of course. Mr. Director, thank you very much for moderating this panel, for talking to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.